He forced her to cook for him for 30 days, or watch her father's restaurant disappear forever. Tessa Cruz walked into Kellen Francois' office, ready to fight the most dangerous man in Cleveland. But he didn't offer mercy. He offered a trap. Breakfast and dinner. Every day. Inside his mansion. If she impressed him, Rosa's place might survive. If she failed, city complaints, fines, and lawyers would bury everything her family had built. But Kellen never expected the furious little chef he tried to control would become the one woman he could not stop craving. All right, stop here for a moment and look at what Tessa Cruz is walking into. A cold corridor. A heavy door. A man she has every reason to hate. She pushes it open and finds Kellen Franco standing barefoot in front of a roaring stone oven. Firelight moving across his bare back, revealing jagged scars he usually keeps hidden. 3 days ago. This same man pinned her to a wall and gave her a choice that felt like a death sentence. Work for him for 30 days. Or watch her family's restaurant burn under paperwork, debt, and fear. Her father is lying in a hospital bed. Her mother's legacy is hanging by a thread. Tessa steps inside and demands answers. Slowly, the devil looks up. His eyes move over her with a quiet focus that makes her skin prickle beneath her leather jacket. But Tessa refuses to back down. "We're not selling," she says, using her voice like armor. Even if it barely holds. Kellen rises with terrifying calm. She expected a monster. Someone with cruelty written clearly on his face. Instead, she gets a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, collar open, a thin silver chain resting at his throat. His green eyes lock onto hers, sharp and unreadable, with the faintest curve of a smile on his mouth. Every instinct tells her to run, but then she thinks of her father, pale under hospital lights, and her feet stay planted. Kellen crosses the room and presses one finger against her chest, backing her into the wall with a calm that scares her more than shouting would have. Her shoulder blades hit cold plaster. The hospital band on her wrist scrapes against it. His eyes drop to the band, then return to hers. "Who do you think you are?" he asks, almost curious. Tessa lifts her chin. "Tessa Cruz, daughter of the man you tried to destroy." She tells him about Rose Place, the little diner that has fed the neighborhood for 20 years. She throws her father's sacrifice and her mother's memory right back at him. When he reaches for her again, she slaps his hand away. Kellen only smiles. "I can take that place without killing you," he whispers. The warmth of his touch stays on her skin, and she hates that she notices it. "You should have watched your hands when you went after my father," she snaps. His smile disappears. For the first time, something in his face hardens. Kellen studies her as if she's a problem he did not expect. "Most people cry in that chair," he says. "Most people beg." Tessa's voice drops. "If my father doesn't survive, you find out what I do instead." Kellen does not blink. He calls for Bobby and orders pressure on the restaurant. Fire codes. Ventilation. Waste disposal. All three. Tessa's throat tightens. "My father gave 20 years to that place." Kellen's answer is cold. "The city doesn't care about prayers, Miss Cruz. It cares about violations." Kellen starts listing the restaurant's weak points with unsettling precision. An outdated electrical panel, a missing insurance update, a service alley built partly on his land. "I didn't create these problems," he says. Tessa steps toward him. Furious, "No. You just found every small crack and decided to shove a knife into it." His smile returns. Thinner this time. Finding a weak point is the same as making one. She looks him straight in the eye and accuses him of putting a price on memories, hard work, and human lives. "Some things aren't tea for sale," she says. Kellen's gaze flickers. "Just once. Men like me usually get what we want." Tessa leans in. "Then maybe it's time someone disappointed you. If you want to protect something." Kellen tells her. "Prove it worth protecting." Tessa says her father's 20 years of devotion should be proof enough. Kellen opens a folder across the desk. City inspectors. Insurance carriers. The bank handling their refinancing. One by one. He lays out the pressure points as if he has already won. The cruel part is that none of it is fake. Rosa's place really is vulnerable. Tessa goes quiet as the truth lands. What do you want? She asks, the fight in her voice cracking at the edges. Kellen closes the folder with a sharp snap. 30 days. You'll cook for me. Breakfast and dinner at my estate. In exchange, the complaints disappear. It is a devil's bargain, and he knows she cannot afford to refuse. Tessa laughs. But there is no humor in it. Go to hell. Kellen slides the contract toward her. 30 days of cooking. Or complete ruin. That S blackmail. He turns toward the window as if the word bores him. Blackmail does to come with choices, he says. Then he looks back at her. This is my attention. Tessa straightens her jacket like she can pull dignity around herself. I'm not your maid. She walks out before her voice can break. But outside, alone on the sidewalk, she finally folds. Her body shakes with silent tears. A moment later, she wipes her face, pulls her shoulders back, and keeps walking, not knowing Kellen is watching from above. Most people folded in front of Kellen Franco. Tessa Cruz walked out in one piece, then broke down only where she thought no one could see. But Kellen saw everything. He watched her wipe her tears and stand up straighter, as if pride were the last thing she owned. That should have been irrelevant. It was not. Kellen built his empire by finding cracks in people and pressing until they gave way. Tessa did not give way. Not completely. That bothered him. He told Bobby not to use her sick father as leverage. Still, 3 days later, a $5,000 fine arrived at Rosa's place. Tessa sat behind the register, staring at the notice while her father lay in a cardiac ward across town. 10 empty tables with red checkered napkins sat inside the quiet diner. What hurt most was the wooden counter her father, Ben Cruz, had sanded by hand. Now he was just a patient number in a hospital system that did not care how many years he had fed the neighborhood. Tessa pulled out her phone and searched the name that had been burning in her throat for 3 days. Kellen Franco. There he was at a charity gala, wearing a black suit with a beautiful woman on his arm, looking polished, untouchable, almost decent. Tessa locked the screen and shoved the phone away. A heartless man playing philanthropist, to keep from screaming. She grabbed a rag and scrubbed a clean table until Judy started watching her. Low voices drifted from the front, and when Tessa came out carrying 3 menus, her heart stopped. At the best table in the room, the one her father saved for birthdays and anniversaries, sat Kellen Franco. He leaned back with effortless control, 2 large bodyguards beside him, looking as if even the air belonged to him. Tessa's grip tightened until her knuckles went white. Mr. Franco, she said, her voice trembling with anger. If you came to celebrate your $5,000 chimney fine, congratulations. I am still not backing down. Kellen looked up, calm as winter. He ignored the accusation, opened the menu, and said, tomato soup. Tessa met his stare with a sharp little smile. Then I suggest the humble pie, she said, served warm to people who are far too full of themselves. One of his guards coughed into his fist. Kellen raised an eyebrow, his focus settling fully on her now. The food was already beside the point. He was studying her nerve. Order quickly. Gentlemen, he told his men, I doubt patience is on the menu. Back in the kitchen. Tessa slapped the ticket onto the counter. Ray stared at it. Humble pie. She tied her apron tight, eyes bright with fury. I'm going to make him hate how much he loves it, she muttered, chopping bell pepper with fierce precision. Through the glass. Kellen looked around the little diner. He had expected a dump. This was worse. It was warm. Lived in, stubbornly alive. The walls were crowded with old photos. The booths worn smooth by years of regulars. The air rich with onions. coffee and something sweet from the oven. In the kitchen, Tessa cooked with anger and love in equal measure. She shredded tender short ribs braised with tomato, garlic, and roasted peppers, then wrapped the meat in delicate, buttered pastry. Ray watched in awe and quietly accepted the name. Humble pie. When the golden pastry came out, she plated it with smoky sauce and handed it to Judy, refusing to serve Kellen herself. And there he is, the untouchable billionaire who treats people like pieces on a board, stopping mid-sentence the moment the plate reaches him. Tessa watches from the kitchen window, barely breathing. His knife breaks through the crisp golden pastry, and the scent of garlic and slow-cooked beef rises into the air. Kellen's icy expression cracks. He takes one bite, then another, his eyes close before he can stop them. For 1 second, the ruthless man is gone, and what remains looks almost painfully human. Tessa's smile turns sharp. She has not just cooked him a meal. She has found a door in his armor. Kellen is too proud to admit he is impressed, but he lets his guard slip just enough to ask for a wine pairing. Since that is Tessa's ground, she has to walk back out, straightening her apron like armor. A Rioja Tempranillo, she says, bold enough for the beef, smoky enough for the peppers, dry enough to survive your personality. Bobby looks down at the table to hide a grin. Kellen's mouth barely moves, but his eyes warm by a fraction. We'll go with her choice. As she turns away, his voice follows her, lower than before. The meal was impressive. Tessa pauses. She does not turn around, I know. The small victory does not last. Kellen offers her work only after making sure she has almost nothing left. Tessa stops with her back tight, refusing to turn around. When she reminds him that her father could never be bought, Kellen's handsome smile freezes into ice. The kitchen staff may blush over his billionaire charm, but Tessa knows better. Through the glass, she does not see a savior. She sees a predator who understands exactly how desperate she is. He can look generous while tightening the trap. He can compliment her food while standing on her throat. That is what frightens her most. Not his cruelty, his patience. Judy hands Tessa a white envelope from the city of Cleveland, and the taste of victory turns to ash. Their permit is being suspended. They have exactly 30 days before the doors are locked for good. The trap is perfect. Their back exit crosses Kellen's land, and he is using every inch of leverage to squeeze them. Furious, Tessa marches back out and slams a bottle onto his table. You did this. Kellen lifts his glass with maddening calm. I ordered soup. You ordered my family's funeral. He studies her over the rim of his wine. Sit down, Miss Cruz. He wants her angry. He wants her scared. Worst of all, he wants her at the table. Anger burns through Tessa's chest, but Kellen sits there unmoved. He dismisses his guards with one small gesture and points to the chair across from him. Every muscle in her body wants to refuse. Her pride screams at her to walk away. Then she looks toward the kitchen and thinks of Ray, Judy, and her father. She sits hands clenched under the table. Kellen pours her a glass of wine. Drink, she takes a sip without looking away, determined not to give him the pleasure of seeing her flinch. The slow, amused smile crosses his face. I came to test your cooking, he admits. And she asks. His answer is quiet. You passed. Kellen lays out his terms with machine-like calm. 1 month at his estate. His meals cooked. His standards met. It is a gilded cage. And Tessa immediately fights the bars. My father is sick. My staff depends on me. Kellen glides past every objection and offers to pay their wages. As if money can silence loyalty. He gives a brief apology about her father, so controlled it almost sounds rehearsed, then returns at once to the threat. This is her second chance. He warns there will not be a third. He holds her permit letter with careless ease, praising her food while keeping her life in his fist. To him it is business. To her, it is everything. To make it worse, Kellen pays the $72 bill with $100 and leaves the change behind like an insult. Pride is expensive, he tells her. Make sure you can afford it. Then he leaves her standing in the ruins of her family dream. Tessa looks at the 10 small tables her father has wiped clean for 20 years. And something inside her finally gives way. Her voice is barely there when she says, I don't have your address. Kellen turns back, victory hidden behind a polished smile. 9 o'clock. Later, she pulls up to his massive estate. Gripping the steering wheel so hard her fingers ache, Tessa stands on the stone path. And for one dark second, she thinks about poisoning his soup and ending the whole nightmare. She adjusts her jacket and steels herself. But the heavy door opens before she can knock. Greta, an older housekeeper with eyes like flint, stands there as if she already knows every mistake Tessa will make. Tessa tries to introduce herself, but Greta's icy look cuts her off. Inside, the black marble floors feel cold, almost like a courtroom. The house smells of nothing. No bread, no garlic. None of the rosemary that always filled Tessa's home. It is beautiful, enormous and lifeless. A tomb with polished floors. Greta makes it clear that she runs this house. Then leaves Tessa alone in the enormous kitchen. Tessa's hands shake as she ties her apron. So she presses them flat against the cold marble until they steady. Inside the expensive refrigerator, she finds only neat, dull perfection. Labeled containers. Imported butter. Nothing with a heartbeat. Then a slow, defiant smile crosses her face. She pulls out her own secret weapons. Fresh basil from home and a loaf of bread she baked at 4 that morning. Soon the kitchen begins to smell alive. Down the hall, Kellen stops barefoot in the shadows, breathing in a scent from a life he thought he had buried. Kellen retreats upstairs before she can see him. As Tessa finishes plating breakfast, a bright voice breaks through the heavy silence, shouting about how incredible the food smells. She looks up and sees a young man in his early 20s, with dark curls and Kellen's green eyes, but none of his frost. This is Milo, Kellen's nephew. When he spots Tessa, his grin falters into confusion. She gives him a tight smile. Temporary cook. Milo lights up immediately and spreads his arms like he has found a long-lost friend. Finally, someone in this house who understands seasoning. Tessa almost smiles despite herself. For the first time since entering the mansion, the room feels less dead. Milo watches her with open curiosity and jokes that she might have poisoned the meal. Before Tessa can answer, Kellen's deep voice cuts into the kitchen. E.T. enters in a razor-sharp suit and crisp white shirt, a complete contrast to the barefoot, vulnerable man she almost saw earlier. Without looking at either of them, he says Miss Cruz is not fond of him, so if she let her anger into the food, it may be dangerous. Milo takes an eager bite, closes his eyes in bliss, and says, if this is murder, I forgive her. For one brief second, Tessa laughs. It is real and warm. And Kellen hears it. Kellen sits at the head of the table with his cold eyes on her. Dryly, he says that if Milo is still alive, he will take his plate. Tessa brings it over and sets it down without a word, only for him to ask for fresh juice and coffee. Back in the kitchen, she rolls her eyes. Then her gaze lands on a heavy, warm loaf of bread resting on the counter. When she lifts it, the scent of yeast, smoke and stone oven heat floods her senses. It is too good to have come from this sterile kitchen. Where did this come from? Greta and Milo exchange a knowing look. Milo grins. Deadly secret. Milo leans toward his uncle and whispers, loud enough for everyone to hear. Does she have a boyfriend? Kellen answers with one freezing look, and Milo immediately lifts both hands. Forget I asked. From the kitchen window, Tessa watches Kellen eat. He takes a bite of the eggs and pauses as the flavors hit him, unable to fully hide the reaction. Then he stands, buttons his jacket, and announces that dinner will be at 7:30. She is to serve him herself. Once he leaves, Milo offers to show her around. Tessa refuses. I have a restaurant to get back to. Her voice softens only on the word restaurant, and Milo notices when Tessa mentions her father's little place, Rosa's place. Milo immediately insists on driving her there. The whole ride. He chatters about culinary school, perfect risotto, and his supposedly thrilling life in Cleveland. Tessa sits beside him, staring out the window and probably wishing silence were an option. When they finally arrive, Milo walks into the diner like he has stepped into a sacred place. She tries to keep a wall between them. We can't be friends. Then she points at his gold medallion. What is that? Some secret Franco family symbol. Milo laughs, opens the locket, and shows her a picture of his mother. The joke dies gently between them. Let's slow down here, because the past has just pulled up a chair at the counter. Milo asks for a simple cup of coffee and tells Tessa something she never expected about Kellen Franco's lonely life. Kellen and Milo's father were brothers, orphaned in Naples and adopted by different families. Different homes, different oceans. At 22, Kellen crossed the world to find his brother. On paper it sounds beautiful. In real life, the reunion was poisoned by the years they had already lost. They wanted to love each other, Milo says quietly. They just didn't know how. Tessa feels the ache of that settle in her chest, even though she does not want to feel anything for Kellen at all. The next morning brings no comfort. Only a ridiculous list of dietary dislikes that reads like a map of Kellen-esque control issues. Before Tessa can even process a man who apparently hates joy, her phone buzzes with 2 words that change everything. Dad's awake. She drops her apron and runs to the hospital. Heart pounding. On the 4th floor, Ben Cruz sits frail and pale, his hospital gown almost swallowing him. But his eyes still find hers. The sight nearly breaks her. When he asks whether Franco is bothering her, she forces a smile. I'm handling it. Ben studies her face too carefully. You always say that when you re-not. She lies straight to his face. And the ease of it burns. The restaurant is doing great, she tells him. The staff is fine. Franco is just paperwork and noise. But a father's love has a way of hearing what is missing. Nothing is more important than you, Tessa, he whispers, holding her with what little strength he has. She kisses his forehead, smelling harsh hospital soap instead of garlic and olive oil. Once she reaches the hallway, the tears finally come. Then a nurse gives her news that freezes her in place. Her father's enormous medical bills have already been paid by an unknown benefactor. Tessa does not need a name. She already knows where the money came from, needing answers. Tessa goes to Kellen Franco's fortress and waits until a sleek black sedan pulls up. The dark window lowers, revealing Kellen's cold, calculating eyes. With a slight tilt of his head, he tells her to get in. The car feels like another world. Expensive black leather, freezing air, and his impossibly clean scent. The noise of the street disappears. Tessa demands to know if he bought her father's survival. Kellen's voice holds no warmth. I promised he would rest. I kept my word. She accuses him of trapping her in a debt she can never repay. He looks away. I paid the bills so your panic wouldn't ruin my 30-day culinary test. His gaze returns to her, heavy with mocking amusement. Your life is very dramatic, Miss Cruz. It could use better lighting. When she tries to open the door, the lock clicks shut. She is trapped in the quiet luxury of his car. She notices the sharp line of his jaw and the silver chain at his collar, things she has no business noticing. Desperate. Her voice cracks as she asks what he really wants. His eyes move over her face, pause on her green eyes, then drop to the pulse beating at her throat. Make me believe I lose more by taking Rose S than I gain by owning it, he says, then the door unlocks. She steps out shaken and furious. At exactly 5:30, Tessa steps into Kellen's enormous kitchen, grocery bags cutting into her hands like anchors. Greta is waiting, cold and watchful, loyal to Kellen after 12 years of caring for his home. To Kellen is almost a son, and Tessa is an intruder in a world she does not understand. Tessa tells her this is only a business arrangement. She is not here to replace Greta or steal Kellen's heart. Greta's eyes narrow. That is what people usually say before they do both. Then she warns Tessa about Kellen's severe peanut allergy. A sudden reminder that even the most powerful people can be fragile as no one sees. Tessa crushes a garlic clove. A dark little smile touching her mouth. She is not planning to poison him, though his very existence makes her feel like she cannot breathe. She cooks with loud defiance, refusing to bow to Kellen's rigid list. Greta hovers like a shadow, criticizing every chop and warning her that Kellen hates basil, hates mess, and hates being challenged at his own table. Then he picked the wrong chef, Tessa says, tossing herbs into the pan. She does not cook food that apologizes for itself. The oil hisses. The garlic blooms. The kitchen finally sounds like a kitchen. Just as the air grows too tight, Milo slips in and breaks the tension. There is actual humanity inside the mansion. Even after Greta orders them to clear out, Milo stays behind to watch Tessa work, amused by the way she cooks when she is angry, for half a second. Greta's icy expression almost softens before she leaves. Alone with Tessa, Milo begins making dessert with easy, graceful confidence. She watches him and recognizes the rhythm of someone who chose his own path. Back in Ancona, Milo had 3 options. A dead-end desk job, selling himself to Kellen's world, or doing what he loved. I chose sugar, he says, dusting the counter with flour. Far less violent than real estate. For one beautiful moment, the kitchen feels warm, and some of the weight lifts from Tessa's shoulders. But peace does not last long in a house built on control. The laughter dies when Kellen appears in the doorway, his jaw tight with fury. Does dinner now come with live entertainment? He asks. The joy drains from the room. He demands his food in 10 minutes. And as he walks away, the sound of breaking glass cuts through the silence. Tessa carries the plate into the dining room. Kellen sits with his whiskey, still as a warning carved in stone. Whatever tenderness this house hides, it is buried deep. Kellen does not look up from his plate. Greta gave you the list. She did, and you ignored it. Tessa crosses her arms. I read it. Then I cooked dinner. His eyes finally lift, holding hers in a heavy stare. I was in the mood for surprises tonight. Then don't invite a woman you blackmailed into your kitchen. Milo chokes softly at the end of the table. Kellen cuts into the chicken and takes a bite. Too much garlic. Tessa's face tightens. That S called flavor. He repeats her own words back to her from the diner. And a strange warmth rises in her chest before she can stop it. Before Tessa can leave. Kellen's hand closes around her wrist. Her feet stop. The heavy ceramic plate nearly slips from her hands. She looks down at his grip and feels the heat of his skin. Under his thumb, her pulse jumps wildly, betraying her in a way she hates. Kellen's voice lowers into a rough murmur. My mood had nothing to do with your food. I didn't say you failed. When he lets go, Milo sits frozen at the table and mutters. I am going to pretend this was all about chicken. Tessa escapes to the kitchen and leans against the counter, legs unsteady, his warmth still clinging to her wrist. Tessa despises this man, or at least that is what she keeps telling herself. Then Kellen's voice cuts through the quiet hallway, asking if she is really leaving without saying good night. She freezes, hand trembling near the door, as his footsteps move slowly across the marble. He looks every inch the brooding boss now. Tie loosened. Anger cooled into something heavier. He tells her to prepare a menu for 4 guests and casually takes Milo's dessert duty away because the boy needs to learn. Tessa forces a smile. Anything else you'd like to control tonight? When she turns to leave, his hand closes around her arm. Tessa spins around, ready to cut him down. But Kellen does not meet her anger with anger. He looks at her with a softness so unexpected it disarms her. His fingers fall away. I didn't order you, he says quietly. I asked. That lands harder than a threat. She flees to her old Honda Civic. painfully out of place beside cars worth more than her diner makes in years. As she drives away, she tries to hold on to anger because anger is safer. But her thumb keeps finding the warm spot on her wrist where his hand was. Then her phone rings. The $5,000 fine has been paid. That payment does not bring Tessa peace. It brings resentment. The next morning, she stands in Kellen's spotless kitchen, slamming eggs and herbs onto the marble as if they personally insulted her. Milo wanders in half asleep, bringing a little normal family warmth with him. Then Kellen enters like a millionaire Grim Reaper in a custom overcoat and coldly announces that he is skipping breakfast. Tessa, hurt and holding the plate she made for him, calls him out. He answers with ice, telling her he does not ask his employees for permission before deciding when to eat. The words hit harder than he intended. His face changes for half a second. Then he leaves. Tessa tries to save what dignity she has left and reminds him that this is only a 1-month arrangement. Milo sits in the corner, happily eating bread crusts like he is watching the best drama in town. Kellen does not blink. His voice lowers into smooth, heavy velvet as he tells her she is his chef and orders her to feed the others. Then he leaves, and the kitchen feels colder. When Milo asks what is really going on, Tessa spills her anger about Kellen controlling her life. Milo gives her the truth she does not want. If Kellen truly wanted her gone, he could have destroyed the diner in one night. Rose Place is blocking a multi-million-dollar development, and Kenneth Adams has wanted that corner for months. Milo's warning is chilling. The bigger the building, the bigger the payday, and Rose's place is standing in the way of serious money. My uncle isn't the only one watching that corner, he says. Kenneth tried to buy the banknote before Kellen stopped him. After he leaves, the kitchen feels suffocating. But Tessa does not have time to break down. She returns to the stove and pours her anger into lamb, bitter greens, and blood orange, determined to force Kellen to respect her skill. Then Greta steps in. When she sees Tessa reach for a flimsy pan, she silently hands her a heavy, seasoned cast iron skillet. If you are going to prove something, Greta says softly, do it right. Milo takes her down into the chilled wine cellar, where dusty bottles sit in rows beneath dim amber light. It feels more like a tomb than a luxury. As Tessa studies the vintage labels, she asks a careful question about the family that adopted Kellen. Milo's easy smile disappears. He looks into the dark aisles and says the Francos gave Kellen their name, but he is not sure they ever gave him a home. He warns her not to ask Kellen about his past unless she wants the whole house to freeze over. Tessa chooses a bold red wine and heads upstairs, suddenly uncomfortable with the pity rising in her chest. Just as the kitchen begins to feel warm, reality steps back in. Milo disappears. Greta goes to set the table, and Tessa is left alone. Then she hears it. A low, beautiful laugh coming from Kellen's private study. Curiosity wins. She slips down the hallway and peers through the crack in the door. Kellen stands near his desk, guarded as ever. Beside him is Ruth Bellamy, a stunning woman in elegant silk with perfect honey blonde hair. Ruth reaches up, her manicured fingers brushing his temple as she purrs that the longer hair suits him. Jealousy hits Tessa so fast she almost steps back from the door. Ruth whispers that the longer hair makes him look almost human, then urges him to finish dinner, close down that miserable little diner, and start their real evening. Hearing her home spoken of like trash makes Tessa's fists clench. Then Ruth says something colder. Kenneth is tired of waiting, and the banknote on Rose Place can be bought by the end of the week if Kellen keeps hesitating. A sick father signs faster than a proud daughter, Ruth adds softly, before Tessa can breathe. Milo appears behind her and teases her for spying. He identifies Ruth as Kellen's ruthless architect and former favorite weapon. Tessa tries to act uninterested, but Milo sees too much. Careful, he says. Ruth does a lose gracefully, back in the quiet kitchen. Milo tries to convince Tessa that Kellen is not her enemy, But how is she supposed to believe that when her entire legacy is still on the chopping block? When Kellen passes by, his eyes linger on her a second too long, and the air turns heavy. Ruth's sharp voice cuts through it, dripping polite venom about the new help. Kellen shuts her down with a blunt command to drink, then leads her into the dining room, where the real predators wait. Tessa follows and pours wine for investors who see her life's work as a small inconvenience. Kellen watches her shaking fingers. Ruth watches him watching her. Ruth's cruelty is quiet and wrapped in expensive silk. She lifts a spotless glass and says it is dirty, just to watch Tessa lower her head and take it away. Tessa's jaw aches as she swallows years of family pride. At the table, the wealthy men laugh and reduce her whole life to one small restaurant. They are laughing at her father's calloused hands, at her mother's name painted on the front window, at every late night that kept the place alive. To them it is wasted space, costing them interest. Kenneth says they should bulldoze it by Friday. Ruth smiles into her wine and mentions Ben's hospital discharge date, just loud enough for Tessa to hear. Tessa stands 3 feet away, hands shaking under her apron, while those men casually erase her history over expensive wine. Then Kellen speaks. Have any of you actually stepped inside Rose's place? The room quiets. He describes it with surprising care. The warmth, the comfort, the simple food made with attention and pride. He tells the table that some projects only occupy space, while places like that diner give a neighborhood a reason to gather. Kenneth laughs at the sentiment, but Kellen's eyes cut through him first, then find Tessa. You should all try a slice of humble pie before it's too late, he says, her own words. Return to her. Kellen's eyes meet hers, and a faint smirk acknowledges the secret between them. But the real ache in that room belongs to the memory of Tessa's mother, the woman who once kneaded dough in a black funeral dress to keep the family alive. When Ruth insults the diner again, Tess' hand slips, spilling dark sauce across the perfect white linen. Ruth snaps at her as if she is nothing, and Tessa's anger rises so fast she nearly loses control. Then a warm, heavy hand moves beneath the table. Kellen catches her trembling fist. His thumb presses slowly against her racing pulse. Not a command this time. A warning, breathe. The dinner party has turned into a wreck. Tessa stands frozen because Kellen has just dropped his voice and put Ruth in her place. She is not a servant, he says. She is my chef. Watch your mouth. The silence around the table thickens instantly. Ruth's smile vanishes. Kenneth looks amused for 1 second too long. Then Kellen lets go of Tessa's hand, and the empty space he leaves behind somehow hurts more than his grip. She flees to the kitchen and presses her palms against the cool marble. Milo tries to comfort her, but Tessa sees the uglier truth. Kellen wanted her to hear the threat. Ruth wanted her to fear it. Tessa sees through the game. She tells Milo the truth in a low voice. Kellen wanted her to hear exactly how easily those rich men could wipe her away. Milo says nothing, and his silence is answer enough. Through the glass, Kellen looks straight at her, and the connection feels like a web she cannot pull free from. Greta finally shows mercy. She takes the tray and tells Tessa to go home. Tessa tears off her apron and rushes down the hallway. But his voice stops her. Tessa, just her name. Low and heavy, she freezes in the shadows, unable to turn around, because some part of her has started waiting for his voice. Kellen steps into the dim hallway light, looking far too much like the villain from a romance she never wanted to read. He tells her the food was better than those corporate sharks deserved. Tessa almost smiles. Was that supposed to be a compliment? It was a fact. Then he tells her to stay the night. She refuses at once. She would rather freeze outside than sleep under his roof. But she cannot leave without asking the question eating at her. Why did you let me hear them talk about destroying my father's diner? Kellen looks at her and says, because I'm not hiding the war from you. It sounds honest, but it is not gentle. Kellen shrugs and says they are business partners, not friends. As if that explains everything. Tessa grips the door handle so tightly her knuckles turn white. You laid my whole life on that table like an appetizer. He does not deny it. To billionaires like the ones in that dining room. Her family's ruin is just a small complication in a larger deal. She wants to despise him for letting those men tear her world apart over food she cooked with her whole heart. But when she looks into his eyes, the anger twists into something more dangerous. She gives him a cold goodnight, Mr. Franco, and storms out to her old Honda. She turns the key. The engine coughs once and dies. From the window, Kellen watches her struggle in the dark driveway. Bobby points out what is obvious to everyone but Tessa. The battery is dead. The radiator is leaking, and she would never have made it past the bridge. Seeing her rest her head on the steering wheel in defeat, Kellen quietly tells Bobby to have Greta prepare a room and get the car fixed before sunrise. Tessa stands in the cold, her pride scattered across the gravel. She has no choice but to walk back to the lion's den. And because the universe has a cruel sense of timing, the wealthy guests come out just as she reaches the door. Ruth smiles as if she has been waiting for this. Tessa mutters a quiet thank you and tries to disappear inside. Milo steps forward, proud and protective, telling them Tessa is a real culinary artist with her own restaurant. Then Kenneth jokes about stealing her away for his own dinner parties. And the temperature drops. Kellen does not move, but his voice turns low and dangerous. She is not available. It is chilling how easily powerful men can speak as if people can be claimed. Kenneth immediately backs down, though his eyes remain sharp. Ruth offers a fake ride home. All silk and poison. Tessa chooses to stay. Kellen's faint smirk says enough. He has won this round, but Ruth has seen more than she wanted to see. Milo quickly ushers Tessa inside before the tension on the porch can explode. Left alone with Kellen, Ruth tries to charm him and suggests they go somewhere more exciting to escape the dull evening. But Kellen's eyes stay on the door Tessa just walked through. His rejection is flat and cold. Ruth retreats with a bitter, knowing smile, her expensive heels clicking across the gravel. Inside, Gret hands Tessa an oversized soft gray t-shirt that belongs to Kellen. It is only cotton, but it feels heavy with everything no one is saying. Milo jokes from the doorway, trying to lighten the mood. Tessa sits on the bed, trapped by a night she never meant to live through. All Tessa wants is to sleep and forget the day ever happened. But Milo cannot resist teasing her. He jokes that Kellen's bedroom is right across the hall if she gets lonely. Greta offers her cottage out back as an escape. But the playful talk about creaking floors and old house ghosts only makes Tessa sigh. She does not need ghost stories when the real storm in her life is sleeping a few steps away. Left alone beneath the dim guest room lamp, she tries to understand how absurd her life has become. Then a sharp knock breaks the quiet. She opens the door expecting Milo and finds Kellen, sleeves rolled up, looking far too dangerous. Kellen stands half hidden in the hallway shadows, and Tessa's nervous laugh dies before it fully leaves her mouth. His voice is low as he asks whether she has everything she needs, and the simple question sends a jolt through her chest. She tries to look anywhere else, but her eyes keep returning to his open collar and those intense green eyes. "I'm fine," she says too quickly. "You say that a lot." The words are quiet, almost careful. When he finally says goodnight without cruelty, she barely manages to whisper it back before closing the door. She leans against the wood and tells herself she feels nothing. His cologne lingers in the air. Proving her wrong, Tessa stares at his oversized shirt, breathing in fresh cotton and something unmistakably masculine before putting it on and stepping into the shower. Hours later, she wakes to an unfamiliar ceiling. It is exactly 2:45 in the morning. Sleeplessness makes every fear louder. The dinner. Ruth has hand around her wrist. The way he said her name, as she lies there. A deep, rhythmic thumping begins beneath the floorboards. She tells herself it is only the old house settling. But the sound keeps going. Steady and deliberate. Thump, 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 thirsty and tense. She turns on the light, grabs a tiny bottle from the minibar, and drinks it in one frantic swallow. Tessa gasps as the liquid burns down her throat and coughs into her fist. She holds the little bottle up to the light. Vodka. A brutal mistake when all she wanted was water. Barefoot and wearing only Kellen's giant t-shirt. She slips into the hall. The marble floor bites cold against her feet as she moves through the silent house. In the kitchen. One amber light glows over the counter. She grabs a cold bottle from the fridge and drinks it down. Then the heavy thudding starts again from below. Thump, thump. She remembers Milo's warning and Greta's knowing smile. It is 3 a.m, and the secret is calling from under the house. Tessa should go back to bed. Instead, her bare feet carry her toward the basement stairs. The air rising from below is different. Heavier, warmer. Almost alive. She stops with one hand trembling on the cold railing. A rich, earthy smell drifts up, followed by the solid thud of wood against wood. She steps onto the stone and follows the sound past rows of priceless wine. Down a dark hallway where firelight flickers along the walls. The smart thing would be to turn around. Tessa has not done the smart thing since she met Kellen Franco. She reaches a heavy iron door, pushes it open, and finds a room filled with the smell of fresh bread. There he is, the most dangerous man in the city. Shirtless, dusted with flour, kneading sourdough like he was born for it. Tessa freezes. 2 hours ago, she was staring at herself in the mirror, insisting this man did nothing to her. Watching him now, in the orange glow of the brick oven, that lie falls apart. Kellen's hands still. His dark eyes move slowly down to her bare legs, then back to her face. The silence in the basement grows heavier than any threat he has ever made. "You re-drunk," he says quietly. Tessa lifts her chin. "I was thirsty." His mouth twitches. "That is not the same thing. At 3 a.m. The world belongs to secrets. And Tessa has just stepped into one. The vodka gives her just enough courage to demand answers from a man who could destroy her with a nod. But Kellen is not startled. He stands there with flour on his chest, a glass of wine nearby, staring at her with such stillness that the room seems to shrink. "What are you doing down here?" she asks, her voice unsteady. "Baking men like you don't bake." He takes one slow step toward her. "You have no idea what men like me do when no one is watching." The fire cracks behind him. Her mind tells her to run, but her feet stay fixed to the cold stone floor. Kellen stands so close she can almost feel the heat of him. His eyes follow the flush rising along her neck, then drop to the hem of his oversized shirt. The air between them turns almost painful. Tessa pulls at the collar and whispers that she should leave. But instead of leaving, she asks if he is the one who bakes the bread they eat upstairs. For a fraction of a second, his cold mask slips. Underneath it is something raw and human. Something he clearly did not mean for her to see. "Greta talks too much," he says. "Everyone else is asleep." But in that dim basement, 2 wounded people stand at the edge of something they cannot name. Tessa steps closer, staring at the flour on his hands. "Why do you do this?" Kellen presses his palms against the wooden table, his voice turning low and rough. "Do you truly want to know? Or do you want another reason to hate me?" She mumbles something about hearing a noise, but they both know it is not the whole truth. When he moves toward her, barefoot and silent on the stone, the space between them disappears. "Careful, Tessa," he says. "You keep opening doors you want to be able to close." She rubs the back of her neck and mutters that the room is too hot. Her collar slips, revealing one bare shoulder. Kellen's eyes lock on it instantly. You can see the fight behind his stare before he forces himself to look away. Tessa pulls the shirt back into place, her chest rising and falling, telling herself to run while she still can. Instead, she asks again about the bread, softer this time, almost begging him to let her in. And he does, his warm flour-dusted fingers close around hers, drawing her toward the fire. "If you want the answer," he says, "you have to listen without judging me first." Tessa is supposed to be looking at the brickwork, but she cannot stop looking at his face. Kellen talks about importing the stone from Italy, and his voice softens as he stares into the flames. A rare, fragile smile appears. and for a second the dangerous man vanishes, leaving behind someone lonely and young. What makes a house a home? He asks, if not the smell of fresh bread. Before she can answer, he turns back to the dough and kneads it like he is trying to push old ghosts back into the dark. He admits he lost his home at 6, when his parents died. After that, he says, every house had rules. None of them had warmth. The past always speaks loudest when the room is quiet. Kellen folds the dough, his voice lower now, and admits he cannot even remember his parents' faces. He slams the dough down. When he stretches toward the oven, his body shifts, revealing thick silver scars across his back. Tessa reaches out before she can stop herself, her hand shaking as she touches the pain carved into his skin. The instant her fingers brush the scars, his entire body goes still. Without turning around, he whispers, "A gift from the family that raised me." Tessa's throat tightens. Kellen. He closes his eyes like his name hurts more in her voice. His eyes are nearly black in the shadows, and the air is thick with the scent of sweet wine and heat. He cups the back of her neck, giving her one last silent chance to walk away. She does not take it. Instead, she holds onto him as their mouths meet, and the cold, practical world falls away. He lifts her onto the flour-dusted table, his hands careful even when his control is not. There are 100 reasons why wanting him is a terrible idea. Tessa knows all of them. Her father, the diner, the contract, Ruth, the threat hanging over everything. But in that moment, reason loses. Desire pulls them under like a tide. His mouth moves along her collarbone, leaving flour on her skin. And for a moment she lets herself disappear into it. Then she catches sight of her reflection in a tarnished mirror on the wall, and the fantasy breaks. She is giving herself to the man who has threatened everything she loves. Panic hits like ice water. She sits up and whispers for him to stop. Kellen pulls back immediately, releasing her without hesitation. He gently wipes a smudge of flour from her cheek. "Don't apologize," he says, as she slips off the table on shaking legs. The truth hurts worse, because he did nothing wrong in that moment. That makes it harder to hate him. She bolts before her feelings can ruin her completely. Her bare feet hit the freezing stone stairs as she runs. In the kitchen, she grips the counter with shaking hands. Downstairs, Kellen remains in the dark, listening to the oven crackle, his hands still covered in flour. Morning comes, but daylight offers no rescue. In the shower, Tessa scrubs at her skin, trying to wash away the flour, though she cannot wash away the memory of his touch. She stares at herself in the mirror and whispers that it will never happen again. Her own eyes call her a liar. When she enters the kitchen, 2 warm golden loaves of bread are waiting. Tessa touches the warm crust, and her mind rushes back to the heat of the basement and the feel of his hands. She pulls away quickly as Milo walks in, smiling as he whispers that Kellen is the one who bakes the bread. "Don't tell him I told you." He pretends he's mysterious. It's exhausting. Tessa forces a fake smile and pretends to be surprised, while her heart pounds against her ribs. Then Greta enters, her sharp eyes scanning Tessa's face as if reading a confession. She says Kellen left early on business but made sure Tessa knew her cooking duties continued. Greta says nothing about the bread. She does not need to. Tessa smiles and nods at Milo, but her thoughts keep drifting to Kellen. Then Milo casually mentions that Kellen's men fixed her broken car before sunrise. She goes outside and finds her old Honda running perfectly. New battery, repaired radiator, full tank. Sitting behind the wheel, she starts to cry. He is supposed to be the bad guy, she whispers. Not this. Her phone buzzes with a message from Ray, but she cannot read it yet. She grips the steering wheel and tries to remember every reason Kellen Franco is dangerous. The problem is, the list is still long. It just no longer feels simple. For a moment, everything seems stable, but Ruth Bellamy is already across the street, watching through the diner window with a venomous smile. She dials Kenneth Adams and tells him Kellen is getting sentimental. Kenneth's answer is cold. He has already found a way in through the bank. If the diner's loan can be called early, Tessa will lose the building before Kellen can save it. Ruth's smile widens. She has something uglier ready too. Fake food poisoning posts. An inspector on her payroll. And a hospital call that will make Ben think his daughter has been lying to him. The next attack is no longer business. It is personal. 3 full days pass in deafening silence at the Franco mansion. Tessa plays the perfect martyr. Scrubbing counters and pretending she is not waiting for even one message from Kellen. Nothing comes. He has vanished completely. Every creak in the floor makes her look up, hoping it is him, then hating herself for hoping. She loses sleep thinking about his scars, his hands, and those dark, unreadable eyes. On the morning of the 4th day, reality crashes back in. Her phone buzzes. It is Ray, and he sounds as if the building is on fire. Tessa, he says, breathless. You need to get to the diner right now. Then the hammer falls. An anonymous complaint claims food poisoning, and the city is shutting down her family's diner pending inspection. Tessa feels the floor disappear beneath her. Ray is still talking, saying people are outside taking pictures of the closure notice. But then Judy grabs the phone. Crying, Ben saw the fake posts from his hospital bed. He thinks the neighborhood is calling Rose's place dangerous. Tessa's chest caves in. She rips off her apron and grabs her keys. When Milo asks what happened, she lashes out and tells him to ask his deadbeat uncle. Deep down, she knows Kellen would not use such a cheap trick, but fear has already chosen a target. You can see the desperation in Tessa's face as she hugs Judy and begs Ray for a name. Ray only gives a helpless shake of his head. The 30-day peace treaty is dead, and Tessa is drowning in guilt, wondering if pushing Kellen away in that basement set this disaster in motion. Her father is coming home next week, and this diner is all he has left. A false health code violation could ruin their name forever. Then a second letter arrives from the bank, demanding immediate review of their refinancing. Ray tells her they should sell because men like Franco always win. Tessa refuses. My mother's name is on that window. I'm not signing her away. Tessa stands outside in the freezing wind, staring at her phone like it might explode in her hand. She saved his contact as Devil, which says plenty about her state of mind. She sends a message sharp with anger, accusing him of destroying her family business, humiliating her father, and breaking his word. Her chest is still heaving when the reply arrives seconds later. 2 cold words. Office now. Across town, in his high-rise penthouse, Kellen stands at the window, staring at a photo Bobby took that morning. 3 regulars taping handwritten notes to Rose's locked door. On his desk sits another file. Ruth Bellamy's name is on the first page. Kenneth Adams is on the second. The bank's private sale notice is clipped behind both. He wanted to treat her like a closed file on his desk, but Tessa refuses to be archived. When she storms into his office, the tension is almost physical. Her eyes are red, her jaw tight, and she fights hard not to let him see her cry as she accuses him of playing dirty to force her to sell. Kellen steps close. His hand rises, his thumb stopping barely an inch from her face, close enough for her to feel his warmth. If I wanted to destroy you, he whispers, I would have done it on day 1. When she realizes he is telling the truth, her defense starts to crumble. Behind him, she sees the photo of the notes on Rose's door. His voice drops, dangerously soft. He says mercy is a luxury he cannot afford. But his eyes stay on the photo. An old mailman's note, a nurse note, a childish crooked drawing of a red diner sign. Tessa asks him about the tenderness he showed her before. His jaw tightens. Donna confused restraint with goodness. She turns around, crying now, and tells him he has ruined her. Then Bobby walks in with a file and a name, Donna Whitfield, the health inspector who signed off on the complaint. Payment routed through Kenneth. Ruth Firm copied on the request. The fake posts traced to her assistant. The hospital call came from Ruth's private office. Instantly, Kellen returns to his businessman armor. leaving Tessa standing there like she has disappeared. It is exhausting watching Tessa keep her mask in place. Kellen adjusts his collar, gives her his schedule as if she is only hired help, and walks out with Bobby. Alone, she clenches her fists and reminds herself that this man is a loaded gun, even when he is aimed at someone else. Later, back in the kitchen, even the sharp scent of onions cannot hide her tears. Greta slips her a warm cup of tea and sees through every defense. When Tessa finally breaks and admits she has no idea what she is doing, Greta pulls her into a hug that feels painfully like the mother she lost. Greta whispers, "You are the only good thing I've seen in him in years." Then Milo bursts into the room like pure sunlight because he has finally landed a date. Greta laughs and leaves him to admire himself in the glass cabinet. He wonders aloud whether he should grow his hair out to look rugged and magnetic like Kellen. That name hits Tessa harder than it should. She attacks a lemon with a knife and laughs bitterly, saying long hair is tacky and a cheap trick to look wild. Milo blinks. That was very specific. She slams the knife down. Make dessert. Milo, but her mind betrays her. Imagining all the women who may have run their fingers through Kellen's dark hair. And she hates herself for caring. Milo laughs, completely missing the real source of her irritation, because he is too busy imagining himself as some rugged outlaw. The moment ends when Kellen appears in the doorway, silent as a shadow. He watches them and clearly does not like how comfortable Tessa is with Milo. Tessa freezes and immediately calls him Mr. Franco, trying to build distance with formality. He is not fooled. He gives her a long, heavy look that says he knows exactly what she is doing, then tells her to meet him in his study. When she enters, he is pouring whiskey with his sleeves rolled up. The file from Bobby is on his desk, closed but not forgotten. He moves toward her like a quiet predator and asks when she plans to stop calling him by his last name. Tessa lifts her chin and decides to play with fire. She says his first name softly, like a dare. Kellen, his eyes drop to her lips at once. Burning with hunger he is barely controlling. She asks whether he is actually trying to help her, or whether this is all a game. He corners her against the locked door, and swears he has never played with her life. He admits he spent days trying to stay away from her. "Then why didn't you?" she whispers. His mouth is inches from hers. "Because you were already here." His mouth is on hers. Heat rushes through her. But Tessa somehow finds the strength to push him back. She is done being the mouse in his cat-and-mouse game. She asks what he really wants and reminds him that her only goal is saving the diner. When she turns to leave, his quiet voice stops her. He tells her he drove past Rose's place at dawn and saw people leaving notes on the glass. For a second, the dangerous billionaire disappears, and all she sees is a lonely, broken boy finally understanding what a home looks like from the outside. Then reality returns like cold water. "What happens when you wake up and get bored?" she asks. He has no answer. This is the moment Tessa reaches her limit. With tears on her face, she tells him to either truly help her or let her go. He insists she is more than a passing obsession. But she cannot listen anymore. She decides to walk away from him and from the cold house that has pulled too much from her. At the door, he asks why she is quitting on them. She cannot tell him the truth. She is running because she is terrified of how much she loves him. And hating him was the last shield she had. Milo and Greta try to stop her in the hall. But she grabs her bag with shaking hands and runs into the night. Tessa freezes when Greta reaches for her. Then the dam breaks. She lets herself be held, breathing in the scent of coffee while her heart comes apart. Greta tells her to trust what she feels. But Tessa pulls away and runs to her car. Inside, Kellen stands at the window, pressing his forehead to the cold glass as she drives away. For a moment, he looks like a broken man. Then the mask returns. He straightens, calls Ruth, and destroys her career in 10 seconds. You re-off every project. Ruth tries to speak. He cuts her off. Kenneth can explain the inspector payment, the banknote purchase, the fake reviews. and the call to Ben Cruz to the board. Then he hangs up, looking colder than ever. Now comes the bleak reality. Kellen stares at an empty driveway while Rose's place sits dark, its chairs stacked like headstones. Tessa holds a cold cup of coffee as her father and Ray gently suggest moving to a better neighborhood. Judy tries to comfort her, saying family is not tied to an address. But to Tessa, these walls hold her mother's ghost. Outside, regulars keep coming anyway. A nurse leaves flowers. An old mechanic leaves a note for Ben. A little girl presses a drawing against the glass before her mother pulls her away. Across the street, Kellen sits in a black car and watches all of it in silence. Then 2 city workers arrive and reach for the ugly red closure notice. Tessa rushes outside. Terrified they have come to make the shutdown final. Instead, they peel the sticker off the glass. The complaint has been withdrawn. The inspection has been cleared. The bank review has been frozen. Kellen has stopped the trap before it closed. The restaurant can open tomorrow. She should be celebrating. But instead, she stands on the cold concrete, shaking with frustration. A week passes in silence. Tessa looks for cheap rentals while Milo checks in every day. Then, on Tuesday, her father finally walks through the door, frail but smiling as he breathes in his kitchen. "Still smells like your mother," Ben says, and Tessa nearly breaks. Tessa hugs her father tightly and keeps the messy truth to herself until she has a plan. The quiet moment breaks when Kellen's assistant calls and summons her to a meeting at 10 the next morning. Walking into the lion's den is never easy. By 10 o'clock, she stands outside the intimidating high-rise, her heart pounding against her ribs. To steady herself, she wears borrowed black heels, a tiny piece of armor that does not quite belong to her. Still, she breathes in and steps into the boardroom. Around the table sit the same smug, wealthy men who laughed at her father's life as if it were nothing. Kenneth Adams speaks first, wearing a patronizing grin as he mocks her father's cooking with fake praise. Tessa stays calm and tells him she is there on her father's behalf. She looks around and notices Ruth is gone, which lets her breathe for half a second. Then the heavy door opens, and the room seems to cool. Kellen Franco walks in, and Tessa freezes. He looks like a different man. The long, messy, dark hair she once touched in the basement is gone, replaced by a severe buzz cut. It is a small loss, but it lands hard. Then Bobby places 4 folders on the table. The revised plans, the fake complaint, the banknote purchase, and the attack on Ben. Tessa stares at Kellen, feeling as if some heartless stranger has taken over his body. When he looks at her, his eyes are sharp and empty. "Welcome, Miss Cruz," he says, and the words feel frozen. He is back to being the untouchable developer, announcing that enough time has been wasted and the paperwork must be signed today. Kenneth's smile tightens. Kellen opens the first folder and introduces the new architect with the revised plans. Then he opens the second. "Before we begin," he says, "any partner connected to fraudulent complaints, predatory bank transfers, or harassment of a cardiac patient should leave now." No one moves. But Kenneth stops smiling. Tessa leans over the blueprint, squinting at the lines, and there it is. In the middle of all those gleaming high-rises sits Rose's place, small and stubborn, like a heartbeat the city could not erase. The architect explains that the project has been completely redesigned around her family's diner, leaving it untouched. Tessa grips the edge of the table and looks at Kellen. "Why are you no longer buying us out?" Kellen stands, his voice low and steady. "The old plan gave us more square footage." He turns one page. "This one gives us a center." Kenneth mutters that sentiment does not pay investors. Kellen does not even look at him. Under the harsh boardroom lights, Kellen defends her legacy. The investors complain about lost square footage, but he refuses to move. "We lose empty space," he says. "We gain a place people already use." He slides a photo across the table. Flowers taped to Rose's door. Handwritten notes. A child's drawing of the red sign. Tessa breath catches. He saw it. with tears in her eyes. She asks if they really get to keep the diner without paying for it. Kellen looks at her. His eyes heavy with pain, he will not speak aloud. The deed remains with your family. Kenneth pushes his chair back. You're making a mistake. Kellen finally turns. No, I am correcting one. The room fills with unspoken tension. Kellen's jaw tightens. His eyes fixed on Tessa as the noise of the meeting fades around them. For a moment. There is no paperwork. No investors. No war between them. Just the two of them in one word. Home, she whispers. Yes, Miss Cruz, he says quietly. Home. Then Kenneth ruins the moment by pointing out that 30,000 square feet are missing from the commercial plans. Kellen does not blink. He announces that he is building a shelter for foster kids aging out of the system. The land is mine. Kenneth, he says, if you dislike mercy, sell your shares. Kellen gives the investors a cold choice, and no one moves. Then he slides Kenneth's folder across the table. The shell company. The inspector payment. The attempted purchase of Rosa's place through the bank. The fake reviews. The hospital call that made Ben think his daughter had failed him. Kenneth's face drains of color. Kellen tells him the board will receive everything by noon. In the silence, Tessa stops seeing only a powerful CEO. She sees the lonely boy who baked bread in the dark because he wanted to remember a home he lost too young. The man who built an empire because he had nowhere to belong is now building a refuge for children carrying scars like his own. The deal is signed. The diner is safe. When they are alone, Tessa walks to him without the anger that once protected her. She stands close and admits she never expected this kind of mercy from him. Kellen keeps his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. I know when she asks what he wants from her. His answer is devastatingly simple. Nothing. He starts gathering papers, trying to impose order on a room thick with emotion. The diner is hers, he says quietly, and claims the redesign was only a corporate strategy. Tessa gives him a broken smile. Knowing this is goodbye, her voice trembles when she says his name. He does not turn around until the door closes behind her. Tessa steps outside. But the warm sunlight brings no comfort. She has won the fight for her mother's legacy. Yet her chest feels hollow. When the diner reopens, there are no grand speeches, only the familiar chime of the door. Slowly the neighborhood returns. Regulars laugh again. Fresh coffee fills the air. Her father, Ben, rests his hand on the wooden counter he built years ago. They survived. It should be enough. But each time the bell rings, Tessa's eyes move to the entrance before she can stop herself, hoping for a face that never appears. She polishes the same spot on the counter until Judy gently takes the rag from her hand. 2 brutal weeks of silence drag by. No black sedan at the curb. No cold invitations. No piercing green eyes to steal her breath. Tessa asked for space. But now the quiet feels like a sentence. Later Milo and Greta walk in, bringing a brief gust of warmth. Milo teases her about Kellen rejecting his cooking, and Tessa laughs for real before he runs off to his date. Once they are alone, Greta looks around and calls the diner a warm sanctuary. Tessa only stares into her glass. It used to be warmer, she says. Greta's eyes soften, because now she understands exactly what warmth is missing. Greta looks at Rosa's photo and finally tells Tessa what Kellen never would. She watched him grow up. A broken, angry boy who never trusted the ground beneath his own feet. He controls his world because loss was the first language he learned. Tessa whispers that he owns everything. Greta smiles sadly. No, he owns buildings. He has never known what to do with a home. Then she squeezes Tessa's hand and says the words Tessa needs, but does not expect. Good girls are allowed to want things for themselves. Before leaving, Greta sets the spare key on the counter. Not a command. An invitation. The words land hard in the quiet diner. Sitting alone, Tessa finally understands. Honoring her mother does not mean standing guard over a graveyard of memories. Belonging is not about preserving the dead. It is about letting the living in. So at 1 a.m, She drives through the iron gates of the Franco estate. The first time she came here, she felt like a prisoner. Tonight, she chooses the path herself. Bobby opens the door with a respectful nod, as if he has been expecting her. She steps into the amber light and heads straight for the basement. No contract. No threat. No excuse left. Her bare feet touch the cold stone stairs. But each step downward brings warmer air. Before she sees him, she smells it. Yeast, wood smoke, and hot flour. It is the smell of a home she tried so hard to deny. The ache in her chest begins to loosen, because she is finally done pretending she does not care. She pushes open the heavy iron door and steps into the amber glow of the fire. There is Kellen, shirtless and barefoot, kneading dough at the old table. Firelight moves across his broad shoulders and the scars on his back. When he looks up, shock and old pain flash across his face. Tessa does not rush toward him. She simply steps inside and closes the door behind her. She ties her hair back slowly, every movement deliberate under his silent stare. The air between them feels like dry wood waiting for a spark, but neither of them moves too fast this time. Tessa steps to the table, her shoulder brushing his. She pours flour and water, her hands trembling. He watches her with an intensity that feels almost physical. "Is this how you do it?" she whispers. "Not yet," Kellen answers, his voice rough with restraint. He steps behind her, close enough to warm her back, but waits, giving her the choice. She does not move away. Then his hands cover hers, guiding her fingers into the dough. "Like this," he whispers. The stone oven burns hot, but the quiet between them burns deeper. Kellen moves closer, his thumb brushing over her hand as he guides the dough beneath her palms. In the dusty mirror on the wall, she sees them together, his arms around her, his scarred back touched by firelight, his hands steadying hers instead of taking control. In that reflection, she finally recognizes what she has been running from. Not danger, not weakness, a place to belong. Tessa turns, presses her flour-dusted hands to his chest, and meets his mouth with hers. The kiss is slow at first, careful enough to feel like an answer instead of a mistake. Kellen holds her as if he is afraid she might vanish, and Tessa holds him back with both hands open. No bargain, no threat, no pride left between them. His mouth leaves hers only long enough for him to rest his forehead against hers, his breath uneven, his hands trembling with restraint. "I need you, Tessa," he whispers, rough and honest. She reaches up, touching the harsh edge of his newly cut hair, remembering the longer strands he removed like armor being stripped away the wrong way. Tears gather in her eyes, but she smiles, then stops standing outside your own home. His face breaks open with something too tender to hide. His lips brush her forehead, and her fingers trace the old scars on his back as they both let go of the past. They do not need to rush. They have spent long enough running, in the glow of the fading fire. With tears they no longer try to hide. They whisper their love. The fire burns low. The dough rises under a clean cloth. Upstairs the mansion is still enormous, still full of marble and silence. But something has changed beneath it. The scent of fresh bread fills the room. And at last, it feels like home. Thank you for staying with Tessa and Kellen's story to the very end. Before we step back into the night, tell me where you are listening from, and share the moment that touched you most.